Alrighty, good evening, everybody. I was joking with Randy and Judy last week. I feel like a baseball pitcher coming out of the bullpen. First time in my experience in the old Bible class, we've got 3 teachers on 6 chapters, so it's been unique. I like it, though. I think it's been interesting. As the class has gone on, the teachers just keep getting younger and taller. So I think the only problem is we're not getting any smarter, so we're going to have to work together over the next few weeks here to solve that problem. Really just a wonderful opportunity to get to lead an adult Bible class. Such a privilege, and very excited about the particular section of Galatians that I've been given to teach and to lead our attention to over the next 4 weeks. There will be a little bit of a gap between the last and the second to last lesson that I'll be giving, just with respect to the time for the gospel meeting that's coming up. But all in all, I'm very, very excited and eager to get feedback and participation as you might be comfortable to do so. In Matthew chapter 13, we get the parable of the sower. It's a teaching of Jesus. It's one of his more commonly known parables, in which he tells a story about a particular individual that goes out to sow some seed. Farmer, let's say. And when going to sow this one seed, this individual encounters 4 different types of soil. First, he encounters the road soil, which the seed falls upon the road and the birds immediately come and pick up the seed, and there's no opportunity for any growth from that seed. There's no plant or any fruit that comes forth from that. The next type is a rocky soil, where the seed is actually planted, and there's a little bit of an uproot, a little bit of greenery, but because the soil is rocky and it's shallow, the sun rises and scorches away any roots or any chance of life, and so that's really the end of the story for the rocky soil. And then next we encounter the thorny soil, and there's an opportunity for this seed to grow in this soil, except for the fact that there are other invasive plants, thorns, thistles, and weeds for that matter, that choke out that planting and its opportunity or its potential to grow and bear good fruit. And then, of course, finally, we have the good soil, which is planted, the seed generates a crop, 10-fold, 30-fold, 100-fold. And we know the moral of this story was Jesus trying to teach his disciples at the time that the one seed is the gospel of him, of Jesus Christ, and how he saves man from sin through his what would be eventual death, burial, and resurrection. And that the different types of soils represent different categories or different types of people in their hearts and the way they would respond to the planting of that seed. And so it's probably at this point where you're wondering to yourself, what does this have to do with the study of Galatians? Well, when we take a step back and we look at these early New Testament Christians in that Galatian region, really what I see is a great case study of the thorny soil. And the reason I say that is because as we look back at the history of this church, all the way back found, as Carrie pointed out, in Acts chapter 13, Acts chapter 14, back in week 1, all the way through this letter, what we can find is what's called, I call it a Galatian arc. It's the arc of the story of these churches. And it goes something like this. In chapter 1, there's a sort of diagnosis. There's a disease. There's some thorns that have been crept up in the soil of these early Christians. And, of course, what we talk about is the 2 main problems that are found in the Galatian church. Paul calls them out immediately. There's a foreign gospel. There's a different teaching. And it's being promulgated and spread by some among that group. That's the problem. Here are the thorns in the soil. And what Travis spent his 4 weeks on in chapters 2 and 3, we're really focused on the next part of the arc of the Galatian story, which is uprooting that soil. Paul recognized, hey, we have some issues here. We need to go in and we need to level the ground. And we almost need to just start over here because this has gotten a little out of control. And so Paul spends quite a bit of time reestablishing his own ministry, his own ethos, his credibility as an apostle. He does this by directly disposing of the false teachings of the Judaizers at the time. He even calls out Peter, a fellow apostle, and his inconsistent behavior just to show to these early New Testament Christians that nobody is above this rule. and that it is of utmost importance that these things be taken out of the church immediately, of these congregations. And so I'd ask you the question, if you had a garden at home, and you spent a lot of time planting some very good seed in that garden, and you prepared that soil, and it began to bear good fruits, but then you decided for whatever reason to leave that garden alone, and you come back in a month or two, and let's say you come back and realize it's kind of a disaster now, all these weeds have popped up, and all of a sudden the plants that I had put in the ground, they're not really putting out any fruit. Okay, so then I go in and I completely level that ground, and I've got a nice blank canvas to start with. I got really good soil, I'm ready to go. Well, what would be the next thing we'd naturally do? We'd replant the seed. And that's what we're going to focus on in the next 4 weeks of this class. And that's really going to be the center of chapters 4 and 5 in many ways, is Paul is now going to reestablish and reaffirm Christ as the true Savior, Christ as the center of the new covenant, Christ as the only propitiation for sin, and we're going to completely leave in the past all of the teachings and all of the theories about the need for Old Testament, old law, circumcision type of rule in order to be saved. Furthermore, there's going to be a reinstallation of what will eventually become known as the fruits of the Spirit, because we'll recognize that as we study this Galatian book, this letter, particularly in these 2 chapters, we're not just talking to Jewish Christians. We're also talking to Gentile converts, and there will be something Paul has to say to those folks as well. And so finally, when our time together has concluded, Carrie will come back for one last week to conclude the class, and it will be on chapter 6. And as far as my analysis of chapter 6 goes, it's the return of the good fruits. And you could see the natural progression of this letter, where you find the problem, you clear the problem, you replant the seed, and then finally there's a charge given to these people. Go forth, bear the good fruits, work together for the needs of the body. And so I think it's important to take a step back from time to time when we study any book in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament. You know, I fall prey to sometimes Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. They all kind of run together, the GEPC books. They're just kind of these short 4 to 6 chapter epistles, all written by Paul, all written to early New Testament Christians. And you can get in this pattern of thinking, well, it's all kind of the same stuff. But Galatians really points to a model for us today. That though we don't battle with Judaizing influences, and we're not battling with people that want us to take up polytheism or some sort of strange doctrine that might have been taught at this time, what the book of Galatians puts forth is a pattern and a formula for self-diagnosis, self-correction, and the resumption of good works. So I just want to preface our time together with that. I want to lay that framework, and I want this to be the backdrop of our mindset as we go through chapters 4 and 5, because it's certainly good to know the contents of 4 and 5. It's certainly good to know the specifics of what Paul had to say to these Christians in Galatia. But ultimately, it's up to you and it's up to me as members of this body, and even as our own spiritual beings, to be able to draw the final connection of what does this material mean for me, and what does this mean for the Rosedale Church of Christ here in Bakersfield, California. So that's really the goal of what I want to get to as we go through these 2 chapters here in the book of Galatians. Okay? We pick up in Galatians chapter 4. We're exactly halfway through the book. And we're going to look at the first 20 verses tonight as far as just the pure content of the letter. And it really breaks into 3 sections. And the first is the first 7 verses of this letter. And it's really a choice. It's really a dichotomy that's presented by Paul to these Christians. Slavery or adoption. And let's see what he means by that. Galatians chapter 4, if you have your Bibles with you, I'd invite you to open them up. Starts like this. Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the father. So also we, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons of God, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore, you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. Now, it's important to point out that when Paul wrote this book of Galatians, it wasn't a book, it was a letter. And so at that time, there were no chapter divisions. There was no chapter 3 and chapter 4 when these folks had first originally received this writing. And I call that out because there's really a connection between where Travis left off last week and where we pick up right now. You see, when you look at Galatians chapter 3 and the end of that chapter going into the beginning of chapter 4, you see a connection of these verses here. And so if we look at Galatians 3, 23 through 24, we recall it says there that, "But before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, that we may be justified by faith." That sounds a lot like what is said in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, where the entire thesis of these verses is to just define that the law had a purpose. The law had its time, but that time is over. And that's where we get to the bottom two verses here. Read again with me in Galatians 3, beginning in verse 25. "But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. Why? Because we are all sons of God through faith in whom? Jesus Christ. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ." And therefore we get to perhaps one of the greatest verses we'll find in this entire study, that there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And so Paul's really just continuing this point as he gets going in chapter 4. He's just presenting it in a slightly different way. He's just bringing about in the form of a simile. Because he says, "Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from the slave, although he is the owner of everything." At first glance, that might be, kind of like, okay, what is he talking about, Paul? That's a little bit random to just pull out a simile referring to children and slaves. But when we really dive into it, when children are minors, when children are very young, they're like slaves in the sense that they do not have rights or access to their inheritance. They do not have the rights and freedoms of an adult, right? I mean, parents of young children, you don't let 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds act like adults, and you don't give them the freedom of adults, right? Because, well, they're children. And ultimately, it's up to the parent to decide and deem when it's necessary, for that child to have a little bit of an extension of that leash, if I may put it so. And it's the same case for us with respect to God. And that's really developed what is said there in verse 4. That when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, referring to Jesus, of course, that he would be the one who redeems us under the law, and we would receive an adoption as sons. So it's a transformation of our relationship with God. Ultimately, what it is that Christ has facilitated a change from servitude under the old law to sonship under God. So I'm going to pause right there because that's a pretty long monologue that I went on there. And I want to open this up for any questions or comments or any initial reactions you have to this transition between chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. Got it? All right. Very good. Okay, well, I agree. I think Paul's done a very good job, and you can tell that this is a case in the Bible where you can see pretty clearly that there are no chapter divisions. Yes, Janine?
Hebrews 5:8 comes to mind. Though he were a son, he learned obedience by the things which he suffered.
Right, exactly. And so it's a callback to Christ. And I mean, really, when we're talking about the replanting of the gospel, and this really applies to us as well. I mean, when we go out into the world and we encounter people and we try to teach them about the gospel, where should we start? Where should we always start? We should start with Christ, with Jesus, right? Because he is the kingpin of all salvation. It is because of Jesus and because of his perfect life, he was God, is God, came down, took the form of a man, lived a perfect life, and gave it on the cross. And this is exactly what Paul's trying to deliver to these early New Testament Christians that have fallen under some fire here by some Judaizing teachers that wish to really claw them back into the old ways of the old law. Carrie?
I would suspect even this information is familiar to us, but even to the Jews who were in the Galatian churches, it was probably a brand new way of thinking to them because they were so immersed in the law of privileges they now have as Christians.
Sure.
I can see where Paul is really opening their eyes, which is the best way to get back to those people that were trying to lead them astray.
Right, and I think it's always important to recognize, it's really easy for me to sit here and to read out of the New Testament and to read in a historical context that I will never live in. I have never come from a Jewish heritage culture. I'm not currently in a church that is, in a battleground with respect to Judaizing teachers. You could sit here and make this is so simple. Come on, guys. I mean, follow Christ. But, Carrie makes a good point that when you are of a nation that has a long history of these deep and abiding traditions, and I mean, this is all of your descendants or all of your ancestors rather, had clung to these teachings and clung to these practices. I mean, that's a very difficult thing to let go. And that's obviously what requires faith. And that's what Paul is charging these folks to have, is he's asking these folks to have faith. Now, maybe a more applicable context for us today is the world pressures us not to Judaism, but really to immorality and just worldliness and just the total rejection of religion at large. And so as that becomes more and more normalized throughout society today, there's a call to individuals in 2022 to give up faith, or to have faith, to give up that facetious worldly thinking to cling to Christ, even though it's so different. And so there's important connections to draw from that. Ultimately, what the point and the message that Paul is sending is this: man was not given access to inheritance from God, and that inheritance, of course, eternal life, until the fullness of time had come. And the fullness of time did not come until Christ fulfilled all of the prophecies foretold of him, until he lived his perfect life, died, was buried, raised, and ascended. Then the fullness of time had come, and now, praise be to God, because we are extended that opportunity. The grace of God has been fully extended to us today. The opportunity to be a child and an heir of God. And what greater thing can there be in this world than that? And it's all fulfilled, of course, through Jesus, and by no means fulfilled through any old law of Moses. That's ultimately what Paul's hammering out here. So as we move on to the next section of this, and we look at Galatians 4 and 8 through 11, Paul makes this point, right? And makes this clear cut between the old law and Christ, and he has this question: so why turn back? Read with me beginning in verse 8. Where Paul says there, however, at that time, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which by nature are no gods. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental things to which you desire to be enslaved all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. So I have a question. This statement right here, when you did not know God, is he referring, or is he directing this towards the Jewish Christians or the Gentile Christians? What do we think?
I'd say Gentiles.
Okay, why do you think that, Justin?
Because he says that in verse 8 that you were slaves to those that by nature are not gods.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like a comment to the Gentiles.
Sure, it definitely seems kind of a Gentile slant. Is there anybody that wants to make a case for why this could also be sent to the Jews? Cindy?
I think it could be both, because in verse 9, he explains what that phrase means.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, I don't know God, it's God being able to know me, which can only happen through Christ.
Sure, okay. Larry?
In verse 4, he makes that point that, that the mystery that no one knew has now been solved. And that is, this is the way the Savior's coming. But all things are changed.
Mm-hmm.
So those of you that were under something before, you're no longer under that. If you insist on being under it now, you in fact are making it your own.
Right.
Because it is now a false religion in the sense that it's been superseded. When one law supersedes another one, you can't say, no, I want to go back to the first law. I'm going to ignore the second law.
So there's real irony in that, right? Because, throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites and the Jews, they kept getting tripped up on idol worship, idol worship and go back to the law of Moses and back to the law of Moses. But now that Christ has come, the idol worship is actually now also including the law of Moses, which there's kind of an irony in that. Ian?
He uses the same term in verse 9.
Mm-hmm.
It says, how can you turn back against the weak and worthless basic forces?
Sure.
As in verse 3, so also we, when we were minors, were enslaved under the basic forces of the world. And so it seems to at least be applicable to the Jews, if not to the entirety of the congregation, for sure, because he's making this very long argument. And you can't just piecemeal Paul's argument because it will undercut the entirety of what it is he's trying to say. And there's so many bad doctrines that have come from that. You have to look at the entirety of his argument.
Sure, and let's not forget that even the law of Moses as it stood at this time had been corrupted even by Pharisees and sort of politiques that had gotten in there to sort of slant the original old law to be a little more favoring towards even what some of the higher-ups in the religious cultures, if you will, wanted to do. So it's like you said, there's all kinds of corrupt teachings at that time. I think these are all extremely valid. Go ahead, Jessica.
Paul might have been thinking of himself at that point as well, because he, being a Pharisee himself, might have thought he had a great understanding of God.
Mm-hmm.
But then when he fully understood about Jesus, his understanding took a turn. Because what the Jews had thought they knew about God was completely wrong. They were looking at God too physically. They needed to look more spiritually, and that's what Paul's trying to get them to understand right now.
Right. And there's an interesting phrase that we'll circle back to on that. But ultimately, I think it's going to both. And it's interesting because some of the reasons that have been brought up are sort of outside even this slide, which I appreciate. But, for the Gentiles, it is true ignorance of God, right? I mean, that just naturally comes with uncircumcision at that time. I mean, no knowledge of Jehovah God, even the God of the Israelites, or even just maybe elementary knowledge of this God, but no real relationship with God until Paul and these apostles and the disciples of Jesus start teaching this new covenant and baptizing Jews and Gentiles in the name of Christ. And for the Jews, we had talked about this a little bit in the previous class, but of course the polytheistic pressures and the idol worship and the corruption of even the law of Moses at that time. And I want to really circle in here on verse 9. Let's go back to... Verse 9 says this, but now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how is it that you turn back again? So it's kind of interesting. I think we brought this up as well. There's a difference between knowing of God and having actual knowledge of, yes, there is a God, and there's a God that exists, or people believe in a God, and knowing God in the sense they have a relationship with Him. I'll take it a step further, being known by God. That's really sort of the ultimate relationship that we all should seek as Christians and as children of God. And so it's interesting because here's one statement that goes two different directions. There's something for the Jews to take, and there's something for these Gentile converts to take. At the end of the day, what's the main problem? They're both turning back to enslavement. They're both turning back to their former ways. Now, those former ways might be slightly different based off of their respective backgrounds, but Paul sees this pattern, and he's here to step in front of that and correct this as quickly and as properly as possible. Cindy?
I think too, the Gentiles it's helping the Gentiles understand their Jewish brethren. If Paul's explaining more of this, the background and stuff to them and how it all fits together.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're both gaining a lot of help from this letter.
Yeah, and I think that's a good call out. And it kind of goes back to what Ian had said earlier, that you can't piecemeal what Paul's saying here and say, well, this is only for one section or this is only for the other. I mean, he's just made this point back in verse 26 that we're all sons of God. In verse 28, there's neither Jew nor Greek. So, whatever I'm putting into this letter, it's for all of you. And there's a little bit of this, like if the shoe fits, wear it type of complex, as there really is throughout the entire Bible for all of us today. But it's important to note that, this is for the whole congregation. And we're not here to splice out the Jewish Christians from the Gentile Christians. We're done with that. We're all sons of God because we were all baptized into His body through Christ. So why turn back? And I think Paul's really kind of struggling with this. And, you observe days and you observe months and seasons and years, and I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. And this is where Paul begins to get very personal. And this is an extremely strong method of persuasion with respect to just even in literary styles. But I mean, you got to think about Paul's position here. He went and saw these people on his first missionary journey. He's going to go into a little bit of detail in the following verses about what exactly he was going through when he had first come upon these Christians, these at the time unconverted Christians. And you can just imagine, you read the stories of, I mean, let's just take a minute and just go back to Acts chapter 13 and just remind ourselves of what Paul was really going through at the time in which he was helping to establish some of these early churches. And so, just as a way of reminder, we see that in verse 49 of Acts chapter 13, that the word of the Lord was being spread through the whole region. And these are the missionaries that eventually are driven. They're in Antioch, and they're being driven out of Antioch. But verse 50 there says, the Jews aroused the devout women of prominence and the leading men of the city and instigated a persecution against Paul and Barnabas and drove them out of their district. Notice the response, right? What a great verse we have here. But they shook off the dust of their feet in protest against them, and they went to Iconium. Right? So Paul and Barnabas are traveling. They're away from home, and they're getting beat up, literally getting beat up. And what we find immediately after is that this journey goes to Iconium, and then the teaching spreads. We read in verse 5 that when an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat and to stone them, they became aware of it, and they fled to the cities of somebody help me out pronounce that. Carrie, how do you pronounce that? No, it's okay. I'll do better than that. Lystra, Derbe, and the surrounding regions. What I'm getting at is they went to southern Galatia, and that's where these churches began to get established. And so my point in this is just imagine you're Paul, and imagine that you've put this work in to help these people to see the greatest gift of all, the gospel, the salvation of sins through Jesus Christ. And you've risked your life. You've sacrificed time. You've sacrificed whatever Paul could have been doing with his life. Certainly he gave up the prominence of being a Pharisee, and he put it all on the line for people just like these congregations in Galatia. And then he hears word that here come the Judaizers. And we know this, that as Paul was being driven out of each of these regions, the Judaizers would just go try to find all those congregations, and all the work that Paul done, they try to go just take that and bring it right back to where it should be, right? In teaching the old law. And Paul is fighting this constant battle. I mean, it's like 1 against 1,000,000, it must seem like for him at times. And here, he's really going to start to explain to these Galatian Christians, this is really upsetting just for me personally, and for the relationship that I have with you, and it really pains me to see you make these decisions and get off the path, especially so quickly. I mean, go back to verse 1. He's just so amazed that they've taken up a different gospel. So, as we look at the final 9 or 10 verses or so of this lesson, I call this out as Paul's appeal to his ethos, pathos, and logos. And this is a callback for me when I was in junior college. I remember taking an English class and learning about the literary usage of persuasion, ethos, pathos, and logos. And of course, ethos being an appeal to credibility. And we've seen Paul do this already in this letter. He's referenced his work as in his ministry. He's referenced already what he's done for this group in Galatia. He's reestablished himself even by correcting Peter and calling out Peter and sharing that with the Galatians. There's pathos, which is the appeal to emotion, which we've already got a glimpse of, right? And Paul's going to continue down this road where he's going to actually share some personal feeling and some personal persuasion. I really love all of you in these churches, and I don't want to see you go down this road, just much like a brother would say to a sibling or a parent to a child. There's that genuine emotional care. And then finally, logos, which is the appeal to logic. And Paul has certainly delivered quite a logical punch. A lot of what Travis covered in chapters 2 and 3 was just about dissecting and completely obliterating all of the false teachings about the need for circumcision in the new covenant, for example. So we start with Paul's pathos, and that's the appeal to the emotion. We've already seen that in verse 11, but we'll read it again, where he says, I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. I beg of you, brethren, become as I am, for I also have become as you are, and you have done me no wrong. And so this points back to a personal relationship, some emotion, some connection that Paul has with these folks. I became like you are. So please, almost like be imitators of me. We've seen Paul say that elsewhere. This phrase right here, that I have become like you, reminds me a lot of what he said to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And just listen to what he says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and beginning in verse 19. When Paul says that, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may by all means save the more. We know that's Paul's attitude. That's his mantra. He's going to do whatever he can to bring as many people to Christ. And he's connected that all the way back, and he said that verbatim back to the Galatians. I became like you were. Please be imitators of me. Take me seriously. Get away from these false brethren. Okay? And so we see that's an appeal to his emotional side. Down there at verse 19 and 20, he'll do it again. My children, with whom I am again in labor until Christ is formed in you. But I wish I could be present with you now to change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. And so, again, calling them his children, just trying to display to them how much care and concern he has for these folks to see that they're going down the wrong path. Telling them that if it were up to him, he would be there right now. He would drop everything to be there right now if his circumstances could permit it. All in an effort to convince these early New Testament Christians to go back to the Word, to go back to the truth, to go back to Christ. Next, we find some logos, some logical appeal. That's kind of seen there in verses 17 and 18. Paul says there that they eagerly seek you, not commendably, but they wish to shut you out in order that you may seek them. But it is good always to be eagerly sought in a commendable manner, and not only when I am present with you. And so what he's really talking about there in verse 17, when he says, they eagerly seek you not commendably, who was Paul referencing in that moment? The Judaizers, right? So here are these false brethren. Oh, they want to seek you, and they do it, they kind of really come after you, and maybe they show some care and concern, and they really want to win you over, right? They have their own ethos, logos, and pagos that they're trying to draw you into their teachings. But what does he say? They seek you not commendably, but they wish to shut you out in order that you may seek them and not the truth instead. And of course, we see this all the time in today's world, right? There's no instance where someone's trying to use some sort of persuasive tone to try to block out a different argument, or I'm not referencing politics at all or anything, right? Of course, that's what we see in the world today. We have to be mindful of that as Christians, that no matter what the world or what even anyone has to say to us with regards to anything we may believe, we always have to reflect back to the Word. And that's a 1 John 4 concept of testing the spirits to see that they are from God. So, a little quick note there on 18 before I move on is that this is how it reads in the New American. It says, but it is good always to be eagerly sought in a commendable manner, and not only when I am present with you. That's a little bit confusing, at least in my mind. Who here has an NIV? Raise your hand if you have an NIV. Justin, can you read what verse 18 says for you?
It is fine to be zealous, provided the purpose is good, and to be so always, not just when I am with you.
Thank you, Justin. And so that's kind of a little bit clearer translation that it's okay to be zealous when the cause is good, right? And so Paul really kind of shoots down the idea of, hey, these Judaizing teachers are coming after you, and they want you to be zealous for their teachings. But he doesn't want to overly discourage these Christians. He says, look, I want you to be zealous, but I want you to be zealous for that which is good. And don't just be zealous when I'm here, but be zealous all the time. That's a good and commendable thing to do, and that's the right attitude to have. And that's really Paul's appeal to logic, frankly, there in verses 17 and 18. And then finally in 13 through 16, I know we've kind of gone out of order here, but he's going to appeal back to his credibility. And this is where I actually want to wrap this up, because to me this packs the biggest punch. Verses 13 through 16 go like this: "But you know that it was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you in the first time. And that which was a trial to you in my bodily condition, you did not despise or loathe me, but you received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself. Where then is the sense of blessing you had? For I bear you witness that if possible you would have plucked your eyes out and given them to me. Have I therefore become your enemy by telling you the truth?" And so there's really quite a charge given right here to these Galatian Christians. Of course, this directly refers to an issue right at Paul. I mean, this is a very personal matter for Paul, because it turns out, as we've already noted in this class, that the some among you in the congregation that have been promulgating this false doctrine have also been attacking the credibility of Paul. And so you can imagine, put yourself back in the shoes of Paul. You've done all this work, you know these people, you care for these people, you love these people, and they're being convinced that you're the false teacher. And now it's time for Paul to say, there's none of that. Let's get this straight. I came to you almost by accident, right? It was by bodily illness. We don't really know the details of it. We never really will, frankly. But we know that it was at a time where he was heavily oppressed by the Jews at that time on that first missionary journey, as he was being ran out of Antioch, and then he gets into the southern Galatian region. He goes, it was almost accidental that we ran into each other. But how did you receive me at that time? It says right there that you received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself. So what changed? You know, why is there a narrative now that Paul is the bad guy among the churches in Galatia? Well, it's because of these false teachers, right? And so that's where he asks the question, where then is the sense of blessing that you had? What changed? Why now? For I bear you witness that if possible you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me. Paul's kind of exaggerating, but he says, I could have at that time, you were so happy to see me that I could have asked you to pull your own eyes out and give them to me, and you would have done it. Right? That's his sort of almost, hyperbolic way of explaining just how much the Galatians loved having Paul there when he was teaching them in those early days. So it's interesting, because when you put this all together, you have a string of 10 or 11 verses that are pretty irrefutable. He's taken time to go after them with his own credibility, with his own emotional appeal, and with some hard logic. And you can tell Paul's in the mode of replanting the seed. We're getting back to Christ. We're getting back to the source of salvation. We just have to do away with all of this clinging to the old law and all of the thorns that are cropping up in our soil. That's become a real issue. So, that's going to bring us right to the end. I've got us a few minutes early, but a couple of interesting parallel scriptures for you to take throughout the week with you. If you choose. I found interesting connections. Paul, this is not the first time he's had to write this kind of letter. And much of the New Testament does have some overlapping theme. Paul is the writer of a lot of these epistles, and they are going to early New Testament congregations. And it's interesting to see the harmony of the message, and you can get a little bit of insight into some of the individual problems of each of the groups. But it's my own personal opinion that as I look at Galatians 4, I see parallels with Romans chapter 7, really centered around believers that are united in Christ. Ephesians chapter 2, which really speaks to the topic of us being made alive in Christ. And 1 Corinthians chapter 4, being servants of Christ. And so, just by means of additional study, I would just encourage you to thumb through the New Testament this week and try to find your own parallels or your own cross-references, particularly among Paul's teachings to some of the other congregations. What might be similar to what's being talked about here in the first half of Galatians 4. So, I'm going to open it up to any comments. Carrie, go ahead. Thank you. Okay. Well, no guarantee I'll ever get that one right. But next week, we're going to pick up in verse 21. We will finish chapter 4. The following week, we will be focused on chapter 5 through about verse 13. And then I will conclude this portion of our study with the rest of chapter 5 in the first week of November. So, am I missing any hands? I'm sorry. Oh, Ian, sorry.
I just thought it was interesting that in verse 15, I testify about you that if it were possible, you would hold out your eyes and give them to me. He was making a tongue-in-cheek kind of argument in that way that you would have gone blind to hear the truth, but instead you sought after something false and instead become blind,
Interesting.
even though they still retain their sight.
Yeah, that's actually really.
There is what goes in that section.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good analysis of that. I appreciate that. So, with that, we'll conclude the class tonight. I appreciate everyone's attention, and we'll see y'all next week.